to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Thion. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
This time on the Disrupt Your Career webcast, we are welcoming Dr. Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic, who is an international authority in people analytics, talent management, leadership development, and the human AI interface, a very long list of wonderful things he does. He's the chief talent scientist at Manpower Group, co-founder of Deeper Signals and Metaprofiling, and professor of business psychology at both University College London and Columbia University. He's previously held academic positions at a long list of incredibly eminent institutions like NYU, LSE, and he's lectured at Harvard Business School, Stanford Business School, London Business School, Johns Hopkins, IMD, and INSEAD, as well as being the CEO at Hogan Assessment Systems. One does wonder when he sleeps, but perhaps he'll tell us about that. Dr. Tomas has published 10 books and over 200 scientific papers, making him one of the most prolific social scientists of his generation. He's a frequent contributor to Fast Company, The Guardian, Forbes, and the Harvard Business Review. And you can find him on Twitter at DRTCP, which are his initials with doctor, or online at drtomas.com. It's a great pleasure to have you here, Tomas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's get started. So many different things to explore. The first page of your personal website starts with the statement, I use science and tech to help organizations predict human performance. So what have science and tech told you about careers so far? Are there any sort of specific patterns that lead people to be fulfilled or, on the contrary, unhappy in their careers?
Perhaps the main learning has been that there are patterns to people's choices. So if you look at the science part in particular, for about 5 or 6 decades, a lot of organizational psychological research and research within vocational psychology have converged in highlighting the early kind of antecedents that make people gravitate towards certain jobs and that make their natural dispositions, what you might call personality or competencies or values, a better fit for certain careers. And, you know, my conclusion of this part of research and the science is that really talent to some degree is personality in the right place. That if you can understand who you are or who someone is, and then you understand the requirements of a job or a career, you match people's natural predispositions to the area they're in, those predispositions or attributes will manifest themselves as talent. That's the science part. Technology is just a new level or a new dimension to obtain the data that we need to verify, predict, or refute or disprove our hypotheses. If you think about data and AI in today's world, it's like a different level, 10x level of magnitude of a kind of telescope or microscope that enables you to go to a system or organization and truly understand what is going on. And so far, we haven't had to kind of revise all of the scientific theories of career choices and what people do. We've mostly confirmed them. And the big revolution from the technology side of things is our ability to then apply that science to streamline or automate things like career recommendations or recruitment.
Indeed. And I guess it's fascinating to hear that sort of latter part of the conclusion, because what I was thinking as you were talking about that is that all of this depends on the ability either of the individual to know him or herself well enough to go forward for the right kind of places where they will fit, or for the organization to have the intelligence and the courage to be looking out for the right kind of fit and or tech that allows that to happen almost magically or in a godlike way, whereby something magic happens beyond the individual and the organization. And I guess that's where it gets messy and far from perfect so far, right?
Yeah, I think, this is a cliche, but of course, the complexity of today is much higher than before. And, I think there are probably relevant parallels between the world of careers and the world of relationships, if you like, because in the old days, you just marry someone in your local village because there was no one else, or your parents told you, hey, the son or daughter of our neighbor sounds decent, why don't you go? And and that often actually was a pretty good recipe for longevity. But then if you fast forward 200 or 300 years and you're in a world where there's endless possibilities with more alternatives and more choices, as Facebook would say, things are complicated, or it's complicated, so you need a science. And it's the same in the world of careers. And for most of our modern history, we made career decisions much like as if we were people making relationship decisions based on a drunken night out at the bar. It was serendipitous, and so go be a doctor, a lawyer like your aunt or like your cousin who's making good money. And we actually listen to people. And that's okay if there are only 5 choices, but when you have 500,000 choices, it helps to understand what goes on. And fundamentally, it helps to understand yourself.
Absolutely. And of course, the other big factor in there is that sort of 25 years plus ago, when we were told to be obedient children and go off and do medicine or engineering or whatever, we also went into that assuming we'd be doing it for life. Whereas not only now are there the 500,000 choices, but you can make that choice again and again as often as every year, if not more so. So as you say, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's complicated, and it's always easier to make choices for other people. I can tell you, yes. we can meet at an airport or in a bar, and I can say, oh, you should do that. And then I don't care anymore if you're stuck with that but if you really want to take ownership of your future and your career, you have to think, and you have to leverage all the tools and resources that are available.
So let's get into this a little bit. Let's think about the ways that artificial intelligence and psychometrics in general can help individuals to manage their careers better, or indeed to make better career decisions, if you want to make that distinction.
Mm-hmm. So historically, psychometric tools such as psychological assessments, they have a very interesting trajectory where they started as abnormal tools because they were used in clinical settings first to see if you had problems. Then they migrated onto education, still to see if you had learning difficulties and problems, but then also more focus on strengths, you would say now, or what you could and should do. And then they ended up kind of in the world of work and careers, which makes sense because, you're not a completely different person when you finish high school and enter university, or when you finish college and enter the world of mature kind of employment or work. So you are you, and the same tools and methods can be used from a very early age to trace what changes and also what stabilizes around your interests, your abilities, your skills, your knowledge, and your expertise. However, the minute that these tools got kind of co-opted by HR, if you like, they became quite exclusive and elitist. They started right after, especially McKinsey 27 years ago or so, invented this idea of the war for talent. The tools were deployed with the elite, with the vital few, with hypos, with individuals that were predicted to be the future stars or the future leaders of the company. And that explains the unfortunate gap that there is between the people who should actually be assessed to understand themselves and to be matched to a certain career or job that is relevant to them, and the people who actually do. And, historically, psychometrics ended up being something very complex, quite expensive, very high touch as well. We transitioned from actually focusing on the data and the prediction side to focusing on the story part. And so most tools today are used by coaches who want to give an interesting story to people about themselves, but they tend to be leaders. And here's where AI kind of creates a big opportunity to actually scale this and make it more inclusive. Because where you needed 300 questions, today you need maybe 3 questions, through data mining and a lot of data that are available. These kind of machine learning algorithms can tell you what are the, in a way, it's the question that everyone who studied psychology always wanted to understand and know. What is the single question I can ask you, maybe even one where the dinner party or meet that, again, in a random place, that will give me the maximum amount of information about you? And if you think about it from a common sense perspective, you meet someone, you never ask them, what are you like or who are you? You would ask them, what did you study? What type of music you like? Where do you live? Are you married? Do you have, and we have this commonsensical kind of decision-making tree that tries to zoom or zero in on people so that we understand who they are. Well, you can do that with a few people sometimes, and you're still going to be biased by things like class, gender, age, ethnicity, culture. And as you know, it's not the same to apply this model to one country than another. This is where AI creates really interesting opportunities to replicate this on a grand scale and really try to translate the things that we do and say and choose into a working model of a reputation and a personality. And that's super exciting, I think.
Wow. And share with us a little bit about the degree to which you, with your Deeper Signals platform, have sort of reached nirvana in terms of this aim, this great big goal and mission, which is extraordinarily exciting, but presumably not yet quite there.
Well, it's a great question. So we definitely haven't reached nirvana, and we're very much still going. And when I co-founded this venture a couple of years ago with 2 former PhD students, so it was exciting that we kind of spun off a research program into a tech startup. Our goal was to democratize self-awareness, to ensure that the majority of people in the world end up with insights that create an aha experience and actually improve the quality of their career and professional choices. And of course, this is a very, very ambitious undertaking, because we estimated that maybe 1% of the world population have historically been assessed with a traditional tool. So we want to cater to the remaining 99%. Or if you just limit it to the working population, there's probably 40 million people who complete assessments each year, but 4 billion people working in the world, so it's still 99% of the world of the working world still doesn't get self-awareness and doesn't get feedback on their actual skills. Of course, they might complete a BuzzFeed quiz or assessments that aren't very good, or they might still get feedback from their manager or boss, but that's very, very imprecise. So where we are is we try to create super streamlined and very, very, very short tools that are still ethical and that are still transparent, and that basically enable you to have a 20x or 30x predictive accuracy with one question vis-a-vis traditional assessment. So where in the past I needed to ask you 20 questions, now we're down to 1. And the amazing thing is to track and trace how people react to the feedback. So we have a product that is a digital coach that actually stays, it's sticky and stays with you and employs some nudges and also learns from you to actually revise the profile and increase the self-awareness. So basically, a big kind of innovation is to move from more static assessment to more dynamic real-time assessment and feedback. So what's possible is still much more. What, the big challenge for anyone in the AI assessment space today is that concerns around ethics and anonymity, sort of Orwellian dystopians, and the creepiness factor is strong, rightly so, by the way. I think there should be regulation, and a lot of companies, especially in the big tech space, are getting away with murder right now. But the repercussions and the reactions are such that it's actually slowing down some potential innovations that could be actually quite ethical. For example, if I told you that I can translate your Spotify playlist and your Netflix viewing kind of preferences and your WhatsApp exchanges and your Facebook communications into a profile of your career potential, you probably say, oh my God, this is creepy. But if I told you that I'm only going to give you back this information and you can decide to keep it private and learn or share it, that surely addresses the ethical concerns and the legal concerns. But you're at a point that you can't even go there because people freak out. It's a little bit like another area that we've been researching for the past years, which is video and voice scraping via interview. Before we all ended up defaulting to Zoom for every meetings, there was already a lot of research that showed that you can translate people's body language and people's voice and people's language use into a relatively accurate profile of who they are. But today, if you tell people that you're using face scraping or face scanning algorithms, they freak out, and no company wants to do that, even though they're perfectly comfortable with humans scraping your face and applying all of their biases and prejudices to the recruitment process.
There's a vast amount of hypocrisy in this.
Double standards.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Right, let's get back to some more sort of real life and sort of messy stuff. Like you, we've observed that many people, perhaps even most people, are not very good at choosing the right job for themselves. You wrote an article about this in HBR a couple of years ago. The surprising thing is that even when people are clear about what they want and need from their work, many of them still make the wrong decision. Why is that? And what patterns have you seen that lead to this? And what advice do you have for our listeners?
So typically, and if we're focused, I think, on the area or even the regions or the social context that make this question more relevant, right? Because if you're somewhere where, if you live in a failed state, or you're somewhere where there's 50% unemployment, you simply have no choice. And these problems we're discussing are really first world problems, right? Having said that, a lot of people are privileged to live in the first world, and they still suffer and end up alienated and burned out and stressed in an age where a lot of these problems are avoidable. So first, there's still a very traditional focus on what you should study and what your hard skills are as determined by university and credentials. And that kind of leads to people boxing themselves into a niche or category that might not even be accurate and certainly not have a long lifespan, right? So for example, I studied psychology, and when I started my career, I started as a clinical psychologist, and I only studied that because I thought I'll have patients and I'll treat people, with neurosis or schizophrenia. And I did that. And luckily, I decided to look outside and see whether I could make a contribution. I started then in advertising, and then I got to HR, etc. And that's because I actually had the curiosity and at least the impatience to go and try to go outside. And a lot of people have that luxury, but they don't actually use it or make use of it. So I think number one would be de-emphasize the importance of credentials and educations, and understand that your talents and skills might actually be more valued outside the traditional environments that you in principle had chosen. The second one, I think, is a combination of lack of mentorship, good management, and feedback in general. Most people, this is probably the number one finding in social psychology, most people have a very distorted view of their own talents. And there's a lot of people who think they're amazing just because their parents told them, and actually they create a delusional self-concept and inhabit it and don't go outside until they get a reality check, and then they get angry or depressed. And then there's a lot of people that actually are on the other side of the spectrum and are overly self-critical and overly harsh with themselves about their talents. And we know that women are more likely to fit in the second category and men in the first. So I think getting good feedback, finding someone with good expertise who is able and willing to tell you what you need to hear early on is really important, because you can then recalibrate. And I think the third reason I would note is just simply fear of change. People are much more likely to put up with a bad career and a bad job for a long time than a bad relationship. If you're in a relationship and things aren't work out, at some point you burn out, you lose your patience, and then you can find someone else. But with careers and jobs, you're afraid to change, and then you put up with things even though you shouldn't. And I think ultimately, this explains why engagement levels are so low, even in good jobs and within the knowledge economy. And this also explains why actually a lot of people underperform in their jobs. So there's a big productivity gap from not matching people's actual talent and potential to the relevant jobs and careers.
Absolutely. Let's dig into this change and fear thing a little bit more. I mean, both of us, Antoine and I, have observed constantly that many people stay unhappily in their jobs and don't see the need to be proactive in looking for something else. We know that we're pre-wired to avoid change and to have fear. So you've mentioned some of the sort of problems that emerge with engagement and that kind of thing. What about if we turn it around and we look at the individual who may be unaware or who may be just trying to plan or dream of a career, and think about how can you and do you help people decide whether it might be time for a career change? What are the critical signs or indications from an individual point of view that a person would probably benefit from a career switch?
This is one of the areas that, conversely or contrary to kind of self-assessments or self-evaluations of talent, people can and do accurately self-assess boredom or engagement or enthusiasm, right? So if you live in the industrialized world and are a relatively qualified and educated worker, as I'm sure your listeners are, you shouldn't wake up most mornings feeling that it's just a drag and a hassle to have to go to work. And you shouldn't just kind of gravitate from one pointless or meaningless meeting to another. And you shouldn't be looking at your watch or clock all the time to see when it's time to, wind down, relax, or do your hobby. So I think in general, any activity or task, whether it's paid job or an unpaid hobby, it can range from being tediously boring, meaningless, and alienating and totally irrelevant to that mythical state of flow where you lose yourself in the task and you find that you almost have this psychotic level of identification. Nothing else matters. By the way, this is probably not very healthy either, because then your relationships, your health, and everything else will suffer, right? But I think you have to be closer to the kind of flow or immersion end of the spectrum. And ultimately, you need to believe that it's always possible to improve and get closer to that. So I think that's probably the main indicator that I would say. Again, you shouldn't focus so much on money, on titles, on perceptions. It's how you feel. And in the world of careers, the fundamental change in the last 30 or 40 years has been that today we expect to find meaning from work. This didn't happen historically. Factory workers, assembly line, and industrial or kind of agrarian workers or hunter-gatherers, they didn't find themselves when they had a good day at work. It was just work, and then they look forward to eating, sleeping, or relationships, right? But today, I think partly because we're becoming less religious, less nationalistic in principle, of course, there are rises of all of these things, less spiritual as well. We expect for jobs and careers to provide us with this sense of purpose and this sense of identity. And so if your work and your career doesn't help you define yourself in a way that makes you proud, you should probably consider a change.
That's a really nice, simple way to put it, actually, the idea of pride. It's beautiful to hear you expressing some of these ideas about meaning. I think I'm trying to remember the timeline, but we just recently interviewed Gianpiero Petriglieri, who, as you know, focuses a lot on meaning and had a career start not dissimilar to yours. And it was, you know, it was a beautiful interview, and we've actually turned it into an article in which we explore a little bit more about how people find or fall into meaning in their careers. So,
well, I'm obviously a big fan of his, and my personal career aspiration is to one day be a diluted and washed down version of him, because he is, of course, a lot deeper and more profound. And I'm a huge fan of everything he does.
Well, I suspect the feeling is mutual, and we could all say beautiful things about each other, and it would be lovely, and we should. But yes, it's wonderful to have also concording and contrasting sort of things to say about it. So thank you.
Well, and you know, if I may add to that, because one of the things that he is quite persistent about, which I don't also hear enough people doing, or almost anyone else do, is that our obsession for optimizing for efficiency and extracting ever more value and productive kind of yield from workers is unfortunately leading us to dehumanize work in an age that should be the opposite, you know? So I think that's fine. And obviously for-profit corporations in a capitalist environment need to optimize for that. But I think that there has to be something else. And if we forget that we humans should still be in the driving seat, and at the end of the day, it's not about what you produce, but what effects that has on your own psychological kind of well-being, it's really important to remind people that there needs to be a balance, and a balance is possible as well.
You're absolutely right to point that out, and we did discuss that with him. We admire that point of view, and we know very well that in any individual, there is a point of no return beyond which the productivity and the value creation just isn't going to happen. So squeezing beyond the end of the tube of toothpaste doesn't make any sense at all. And we all need to know what size our tube of toothpaste is, I guess, just to carry on that rather pathetic metaphor. Let's shift and talk about women particularly. There's been a trend over the years, which I've probably espoused a lot with my coaching clients, to women to be less humble, somehow incentivizing them to emulate the much more common variant of hubris that we find in men. And your point of view is that while this seems a reasonable tactic for advancing women's careers, it may actually not work. So why is it that self-promotion isn't working as a strategy? And what alternatives do we women have?
Well, I would say that before we think about why it's not working, we need to acknowledge that it might be even worse when it does work, right? Because when and if it works, all you're doing is to perpetuate a system that is broken and that focuses more on how good people say they are and less on how good they actually are. You know, I grew up in Argentina, and there is a term that you will appreciate that we call viveza criolla or viveza porteña, which is basically something along the lines of being streetwise, but it also emphasizes breaking the rules and playing outside the formal kind of or official rules of the game, right? So imagine you're in your car and you need to fill the tank, and you get to a petrol station or gas station, and you can choose, you go here or here, but you just basically block both to see which one frees up first, creating a massive, that's institutionalized via security. So if you have a culture that foments and nurtures cheating or deceiving or breaking the rules, and then you're focused on helping the people that are playing within the rules to do that, you're not going to improve the system, right? So I don't care if the advice is focused on women or men, but I don't think that it's very moral or very advantageous for any organization, system, or group to ensure that those who say they are good and who express confidence, whether real or not, are promoted and given and rewarded, instead of us actually focusing on what people can actually do and their competence rather than confidence. So that's the first part that I needed to get out of my system. On the second part, actually, it doesn't work for women because, you know, the main technical term for this is this double bind, right? So women are dumped if they don't self-promote, because we immediately assume because they don't resemble men or they're not showing masculine assertive, oh, you know, maybe they're just happy staying at home and being housewives and washing the dishes and looking after kids. Clearly, they don't want to be executives, well-paid executives in corporations. I mean, why would you want to do that when you can stay at home and do the dishes? And if they do self-promote, they're also dumped because they're no longer women. They don't seem feminine enough, we're put off, and you know, they look like Margaret Thatcher or out males in masculinity. So we basically demand that women maintain traditional feminine traits and archetypes, while also assuming that those traits exclude them, make them unfit for leadership roles. And there's such a powerful paradox here. And actually, a lot of the times, traditional feminists, or people that I would describe as traditional feminists, don't like my argument, because at least the traditional feminist argument gravitated towards androgyny and to say that no, women and men are the same. Stop saying that women are more kind and caring, that they have more empathy, that they're more pro-social, that they have more integrity, that they have more self-control, and that they're more humble and coachable. They don't want me to say that, but this is true. And not only is it true, this is also what actually makes them better leaders. So I think we're basically rewarding a group of people for their faults, and we're punishing a group of people for their strengths. This is such an illogical state of affairs, especially in an age that pretends to be meritocratic, evidence-based, and data-driven. So, you know, it's something I've been passionate for some time now, because in my mind, things need to be more logical than they are. And when I see total illogic, it's just hard to relax. You know?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're describing something which many of us have known intuitively, others have known more explicitly. But you know, let's get past the analysis and think about how to fix it. You wrote a book with a subtitle that was How to Fix This Particular Problem. So in a very brief nutshell, what's your advice to both organizations and individual leaders about what we can do about this problem?
Yeah, so I think, and I have three solutions in the book, but I think we can narrow it down to two. One is really follow the science, which means both focusing on the right traits. Let's stop with this confusion or kind of mythological notion of leadership potential that focuses on confidence, on charisma, and even on narcissism, and start focusing on competence, humility, and integrity. And by following the science, I also mean use proper tools and methods to detect these attributes, because our instincts, they are more often wrong than right. And they also come with the added kind of problem that they convince us that we're right as well, even when they're wrong. You know, so this is the main problem with intuition. A few people in certain areas are very intuitive because they have great expertise. And for each and one of these individuals, there are 100 who feel that they're experts, but they're not. And then the second one, which is up, you know, what we're discussing before, and the kind of problematic advice that we give to people. And I think a well-intended industry trying to promote women to the top, but with really understanding the implications of its advice and that there are better paths, is basically to not lower the bar for women, but to raise it for men. Because actually, if you want to help more competent women get to the top, you should start by making it harder for incompetent men to get to the top. By the way, there are also many competent men who are not getting to the top because the flawed archetypes that we believe in or we maintain actually make their strengths a perceived weakness, right? So there are many men, of course, who display high levels of empathy, who are kind and caring, who are altruistic, and who are humble, self-aware, coachable, and emotionally intelligent. But actually, when they display these archetypically feminine qualities, we think that they're a pushover and they're not strong enough to lead.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that has been one of the lessons learned the hard way in the last year and a half with COVID. It's it had wonderful but unfortunate effects on the sales of my book and the articles that I had written before, because once again we see the consequences of having leaders or people in charge who are not as good as they think, and who are charismatic and narcissistic, but neither competent nor honest. When you have a big, real problem like a global pandemic, you can see the stakes are very, very high, and we can all see the consequences.
That brings us very neatly to the last question I wanted to tackle today, which was about some of the opportunities that you're arguing might be coming out of this pandemic. So it's a somewhat counterintuitive argument, which says that in this uncertain, fragile, and weaker environment, staying put in a job is not necessarily the best possible strategy. Can you help us to understand what the alternative forces are that you see that open up these opportunities and make this environment more suitable for changes than we might imagine?
So I think people don't like to change unless they're forced to. And I do think in general, when everything becomes disrupted and our basic assumptions are thrown away and completely debunked, you are outside of your comfort zone, and you're probably more willing to look at places you haven't seen. And I think there's still a window of opportunity to realize that that's where we are when things normalize. I mean, you can see it whether it's executives or companies who are itching now to go to business as usual or old ways of, and because they feel they're recovering some normalcy. And I do think that if the average employee or professional human has now seen the worst behind them, and they are sort of trying to regain or recover their old stability, there is a missed opportunity thinking outside the box and looking at something that could be better, So this is like a little bit, again, as you can see, I like the relationships analogies. It's a little bit like you thought you were in a good relationship and everything was fine, but suddenly your partner comes to you and ditches you and you start again. Well, maybe you're going to end up in a better relationship, And so I think, given that we have forced to reconsider and reframe certain things, and that there is no back to normal or back to business as usual, maybe that's the push we needed to actually consider what else is out there. And of course, you're seeing now in places that have at least stabilized or regained some of the economic power or trajectory that it had pre-COVID, like in the US, you're seeing a lot of mobility, a lot of movement, People are now seeing, because these same individuals were reimagining their careers and their futures during the year and a half that they were in lockdown and stressed, etc. But they were afraid to let go, because in a crisis, you cling to what you have, But right now, there's still that window of opportunity that things are certainly better, but they're also not going back to what they were. So I think, this is what it's, again, another not so nice analogy would be, you thought everything was fine, but you have a heart attack and then you're taken to hospital, and then you realize actually you have an opportunity to change your life and health habits. And then you become, and you would have never done it unless you're put in this extreme situation. I think in extreme situations, we find out who we really are and what really matters to us. And we realize that actually most of our neuroses and our issues were really first world problems that are okay if everything else is taken care of. But now we're going kind of back to basics. And I think, I believe that the number one human skill or power is our constant ability to reinvent ourselves. That's what makes us probably the most adaptable species in the world. And I think it's a pity if we don't use this power more often and we don't look inside us to see what else we can bring out and what else we can express. I think that's basically what makes life fun and what makes humans unique.
It absolutely is. And it completely aligns with the thinking that we have in our work and in our book, which is about constant reinvention, constant career disruption and personal disruption. So I love the fact that we've ended up in sort of perfect alignment, perfect harmony. And I feel we could go on for another couple of hours, but we know that the podcast listeners like to stop at around 45 minutes max. So we'd better bring it to an end there. It's been an absolute pleasure, Tomas, having you here. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I know the listeners are going to love it, and we're very grateful to you for having taken the time.
Anytime. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.